So, Venezuela back in the headlines again. This time, because the opposition leader, or self-styled opposition leader really, a guy called Juan Guaido, has declared himself president and put himself at the centre of a right-wing attempt to overthrow the current government of Nicolás Maduro, the successor to Hugo Chavez. Guaido became I think that the moment is simply because Guaido became the president of the National Assembly on January the 5th, the speaker rather of the National Assembly, and he's decided to make a big push against the Maduro government, partly on the streets, partly in Parliament, and also, interestingly I think, in the international arena as well, which it seems to me is the bit that's really stepped up. Actually, in the overall kind of domestic picture in Venezuela, not much has significantly changed this month compared to last month or the month before, other than perhaps a worsening of the situation of what is really a catastrophic economic collapse in the country, and with that a huge humanitarian crisis. Venezuelan society has been deeply polarised for the last 2 decades. So it's not that kind of Maduro's government is suddenly facing things that Chavez didn't. In fact, the Venezuelan right has been very, very active since the very beginning of the Chavista project, if you like, back at 20 years ago now. Chavez became president in 1999. And the right-wing opposition has always been very, very active. So you think back over the period when Chavez was president, there was a coup attempt in 2002, 2003, in which he was actually taken. He was taken away from the presidential palace by helicopter and dumped someplace in an island off the coast while imprisoned. And that coup was stopped by popular mobilisation. They then tried a bosses strike, which was quite willing to sacrifice the entire Venezuelan economy by sabotaging the oil industry in order to overthrow him. Then a recall referendum later on, etc., etc. Mobilisations of the opposition have been absolutely consistent throughout the period of Chavismo, especially so after Maduro succeeded him, I think. But it's not a new offensive. The new elements, I think, partly come from the changing context in Latin America, which is what I'm going to start with, and also the sudden upsurge in international development. So let me talk about that first, and then we'll move back to look a bit more at the situation in Venezuela and the underlying factors that we need to analyse as socialists. On the economy, I mean, the Venezuelan economy is effectively in a state of complete collapse, and it's for a number of reasons. Partly it's to do with the collapse of the oil price. Venezuela is almost entirely dependent for its earnings on the production of oil, heavy oil actually, which means it needs to be refined mostly outside the country. And the price of oil between the Chavez period and the Maduro period has completely collapsed. When Chavez was president, there was a time when oil was $140 a barrel. It dropped not quite to single figures, but it dropped to $20 or $30 a barrel at one point. And in an economy where 90% of your earnings come from one commodity, that sort of impact of that price fall is just going to be absolutely enormous, and indeed it is. It's also, I mean, there is also, and I'll come back to it in a bit, there is also chronic, I think, economic mismanagement and a massive level of corruption in the Maduro government, which we need to think about in a minute. Hyperinflation at the moment, it stands at 10 million %, right? Now you can't work out what this means. This is impossible. This is like the Weimar government in spades, it's just ridiculous. There was a graphic in the Observer, those graphics that go up and down, and they show you these things. And at the end, there was this, it just went like that, and it said at the top, this page, to represent the real scale of the inflation, would have to be 2.3 miles high, right? So it's impossible to calculate. Economic life is just not possible to manage. In that kind of situation, that level of hyperinflation, it makes life impossible to manage. So you are returning to barter, to begging, to all kinds of stuff. There are terrible shortages of food, of medicines especially. Millions of Venezuelans have left the country for Colombia, for Peru, for Ecuador, for Brazil, all around, a huge, huge migrant crisis. The biggest, actually, much more spectacular in some ways than what's going on in Europe when we talk about migration. There's also, quite clearly, and this is what supporters of the Maduro government say, they call it the guerra económica, the economic war. There is a deliberate attempt to sabotage the Venezuelan economy and with it the Venezuelan regime. by both the domestic ruling class, who are very, very strong. This is not merely a foreign plot. This is the Venezuelan ruling class fighting for its own class interests, and also by international sanctions led by the United States against Venezuela. Now, when I say the context in Latin America has changed, the period for the last kind of 15, 20 years, we've had a period where it's been known as the pink tide, where you can argue about which governments were how left-wing, but there was a kind of left-wing movement in Latin America, particularly the three important countries, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia. You know, was Argentina part of it? Was the Lula government part of it? There are different kind of categorizations of it, but quite clearly there was a leftward shift in the governments of Latin America. And that pink tide now is at least ebbing, maybe coming to an end. The general picture now is right-wing governments who are trying to secure an end to that sort of progressive political environment of the last 2 decades. And what they want to do is re-establish the dominance of neoliberal orthodoxy, if you like, in economics, and they want to ensure that it's the poor that pay for the effects of the world recession. They also, ideologically, I think, they also want to put an end to the idea that another world is possible. They want to go back to those neoliberal priorities. And they want to extinguish both the hopes and also, I think, the historical memory of the social movements that caused such turmoil at the beginning of the century and really took on the neoliberal orthodoxy and the ruling class in Latin America, and in turn took on imperialism and its interests as well. So you're seeing both an economic offensive of the ruling class and the right, and also a political offensive at the same time on the part of the rich and powerful. Now, I think the Bolsonaro victory in Brazil is a kind of key trigger in all this. That it's given a kind of, because of the importance of Brazil, both economically and politically in the continent, it's given, I think, a new impetus to the right and its attacks. But it's a more general phenomenon than just Bolsonaro. So, for example, to take the kind of most prominent examples, the most important ones, I think, in 2015, the Argentinian government came in under Macri, which is a very aggressive neoliberal government attacking the interests of the Argentinian working class. In Ecuador, the government of Lenin Moreno, who was the successor to Correa, the so-called progressive pink tide president, the government of Moreno is clearly very different, moving much closer to a neoliberal model. Evo Morales' government in Bolivia still exists, but again, it's much more implementing now policies that are less redistributive, less in the interests of working people, and also much closer to the neoliberal model, if you like, especially based around the idea of extraction of petrochemicals, of mining, etc., etc. So what you've got is a general shift to the right in Latin America, with Bolsonaro acting as the kind of key boost, I think. He became, as you remember, he was inaugurated as president at the beginning of this year, and therefore a much more aggressive offensive. Those changes of government in Latin America are reflected in the Organization of American States, which is an organization of everything in Central and South America. And at times in the past, it's been very much the tool of the United States, with the exception of Cuba and sometimes others. But generally speaking, it's been the tool of the United States in foreign policy. Under the pink tide, it was much more difficult for the USA to use the OAS as a kind of instrument of its foreign policy and its economic domination, if you like. That has now swung back, and there's now an explicit group inside the OAS called the Lima Group, which is 14 countries. And it's basically the Andean countries and the Central American ones. But it's brought into being in order precisely to put pressure on the Maduro government, which is seen still as the standard bearer of an alternative in Latin America. And the OAS is now very much swung behind the idea that Maduro has to go and that Venezuela has to be taken by the right. Europe has clearly followed this in I think, a coordinated manner. So there's been, some of the governments in Europe have always been very critical of Venezuela, particularly Spain, in fact. But Spain, Germany, France, Britain, our old friends in the EU, are now clearly lining up in a concerted diplomatic effort to put pressure. So I think the phrase was, if you don't change government in 8 days, we'll, not entirely clear what, but we'll kind of wade in behind the Americans and everybody else. Now, America itself clearly plays a very important role. But again, look, there's more continuity in American policy between Obama and Trump than rupture. So even under the Obama period, America was very hostile to the Chavez government. So there were declarations that Venezuela represented a threat to the security of the United States. Quite how was never specified, but once you say it represents a threat to the security of the United States, that enables the American government to constitutionally put sanctions on both individuals and the Venezuelan economy in general. Now, Trump clearly is much more aggressive about it, partly because he's Trump and he's much more aggressive, partly because it's always handy when you're in a particular crisis with a shutdown of your own government to do a bit of red baiting abroad, etc., to distract attention from your own political problems and so on. But there has been a considerable kind of step change in the level of sanctions now. So, a couple of days ago, the American government announced that it was sequestering the assets of the Venezuelan oil company and the subsidiary that refines oil in the United States, which is a large part of the Venezuelan oil market. And now the government of Venezuela has no access to the profits of the sales of Venezuelan oil. They are reserved in some way for the day when Guaido becomes president, and then, of course, they are then released. For those of you who are older, you might remember this. It's got a kind of chilling echo for those of us who were into politics in the early 70s, when the United States did exactly that with Chilean copper. So as part of the destabilization process of the Allende government, probably the most notorious of the coups in Latin America, the United States sequestered all the proceeds of Chilean copper abroad, so they couldn't use the money. You see an exact picture. No one seems to have noticed it very much, but that's exactly what the Americans are doing all over again. So you can see, essentially, what we've got here is destabilization by starvation. That's what it means, because it cuts off a vast amount of its resources from the Venezuelan government, and therefore, by extension, from the Venezuelan people. Now, what Guaido is trying to do is overthrow Maduro government without elections. In other words, this is a coup. It's a coup with international backing. We should be there's all kinds of stuff about, it's the manoeuvring of one part of the Constitution, the National Assembly against the Constituent Assembly and so on. Never mind the constitutional stuff. This is a good old-fashioned coup d'etat in the history, in the tradition of intervention of the right in government and the tradition of backing it from imperialist powers, especially the United States. He's quite a new guy on the international scene, right up there with every other non-entity you've never heard of. He's in an organisation called People's Will, Voluntad Popular, which is actually the sister party of the Labour Party in Britain, which is, well, yeah, it is, yeah. Which I'm going to be fair enough. I think it says quite a lot about the nature of a lot of the social democratic parties in the world. As far as I'm concerned, Guaido and People's Will are part of the neoliberal, quite hard right in Venezuela. The fact they happen to be a sister party of Labour parties around the world and so on, it tells you more about where those parties have moved than it does about the British Labour Party. Now, actually, the Labour Party has come out with quite a good statement that says we are against intervention from outside Venezuela, and Venezuela's political destiny should be in the hands of Venezuelans, which is the right position to take. So, leaving aside the social democrat label, I would say that People's Will is part of the right-wing opposition, the long-standing right-wing opposition. It's dominated by this kind of mentor, is a guy called Leopoldo Lopez, who was in prison for sedition and is banned from standing for office. But these are the really, really hard right, and they are nasty people. The project is quite overt that they want to re-establish an authoritarian, neoliberal ruling class order in Venezuela. They want to roll back the gains of the Chavez period for working people. And in doing so, they have used spectacularly violent and unconstitutional means. The idea that the Venezuelan students, for example, a couple of years ago, they called them the escuderos because they carried shields against the riot police. The idea that these are champions of democracy and freedom and human rights is complete nonsense. They are the shock troops of the ruling class in Venezuela, the elite that existed before and was in a privileged position before and saw its position undermined by Chavismo, and they want that position back. They are more than willing to use, well, they've attempted to use a coup before and they're using it again. They use violence, they use assassination from time to time, they routinely vandalise state assets rather, and it's quite clear that what they want to do will probably result in a very high level of violence and bloodshed against the supporters of Chavez. So be under no illusion that this is human rights and constitutional order being restored. This is a hard right-wing offensive to put Venezuelan working people right back in their place, where they were before the gains of the Chavez era, and to re-establish an unchallenged rule for the elite, which of course in Venezuela, by the way, is also a deeply racialized concept, because if you look at the class structure in Venezuela and Brazil, actually, there's a very strong nature of of white people in the ruling elite who regard themselves as not only economically but also socially superior to the mass of the population. Therefore, for socialists, there's really very little to say in terms of what our attitude is to the coup in Venezuela. We are completely against the return of the right, and we are completely against foreign intervention, and that's neither conditional or in any way in any doubt. We have to start by saying that before we look at even the second thing I'm going to say. Now, once that's said, it's also true, in my opinion, that we can't pretend that what we're protecting with the Maduro government, what we're defending politically, is in any way at the moment a socialist government. And I don't think it was a revolutionary project under Chavez either. There are three things that I should say about it, although I'll be very brief, but I hope they come up in discussion to elaborate. First of all, the process that took place under Chavez was a very positive one, right? It was born in the struggles of the Venezuelan working people in the Caracazo uprising at the end of the 20th century against the imposition of an IMF order. And Chavez was a reflection of a massive and important social movement which genuinely represented a challenge to neoliberalism in Venezuela and indeed the rest of the continent, also to capitalism itself, a challenge to it, and therefore by extension to imperialism as well. Having said that, the Chavez government did some things and not others. Undoubtedly, it raised the standard of living for Venezuelan working people, without a doubt. It did this by using what Uruguayan economist Godinez calls the compensatory state. That's to say, it used the state and the high oil revenues from the commodities boom at the beginning of this century to have redistributive programs, whether in terms of welfare, the extension of education, the improvement of housing, the improvement of health provision. All these things were real gains. They are now, by the way, completely starved of resources and in considerable crisis. But they were real gains. But there are also things the Chavez government did not do. Specifically, at no point did it pose an alternative to the dynamic of capitalist accumulation in the economy. It ran a capitalist economy dependent upon extraction and one product, that's to say oil. It did not diversify the economy in order to meet the needs of the Venezuelan population. It did not capitalise agriculture, for example, to provide more food resources. In fact, it didn't really have an economic plan at all other than spend the oil revenues on welfare projects. Secondly, neither did it challenge the structures of the capitalist state. You did not get, although on the ground there were community councils, different popular organisations, they did not challenge or replace the organs of the capitalist state. So the state was not smashed, it was used from above in a developmentalist project. And thirdly, on the party, Chavez declared a new political party called the PSUV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. This was not a party that was built from the bottom on the strength and the energy of working people, or at least that's not what it became. It became instead an apparatus to impose things from above. It was a transmission belt from top to bottom, not from bottom to top. So it wasn't a model, if you like, of popular participation and popular democracy. So what has been built under the Chavez period as well as under the Maduro period is a new state, the Bolivarian state, still a capitalist one. As Chavez himself said in his last major policy statement before he died, the Plan de la Patria in 2013, he says, the capitalist state still exists and still needs to be eliminated. And he didn't for a second claim that was the case, that it had gone. But also around it, you've got the growth of a new ruling class layer, if you like, a new set built around the PSUV and around Chavez himself as well, of new bureaucrats, new careerists, people who have become privileged above the Venezuelan people, and that they have imposed their own will at the expense of the Venezuelan ruling people. Now, what happened when the bottom fell out of the commodity boom is that class choices had to be made. Not with a plan, particularly, as it happens in Venezuela, but class choices had to be made about who paid for the economic crisis. And under the Maduro government, it is the population, the working population of Venezuela, in whatever way you think of them, that have had to do that. Last thing on the army. Lots been said about the army's role. And I think it's a crucial pressure point at the moment. What the US and the right strategy is to try and make the army desert the Maduro project. Now, the army plays a very important role in the Chavista state and in the party, in the PSUV. It is entwined in the state itself. About half the cabinet at one point were military officers. And it's also running substantial sectors of the economy, including most imports and, most important of all, the mineral sector. So there's a massive new development called the Arco Minero, the mineral arch, if you like. It's a big project in the east of the country. It is run by the army. In it, 150 multinational companies have been offered concessions to extract Venezuela's mineral wealth. It is controlled entirely by the army. The area is militarized. Constitutional rights are suspended in that area. So you can see how important the army is to the Venezuelan state. And it's not an army that's in any way accountable or controlled by the people of Venezuela. It is a traditional army with traditional hierarchies entwined with the ruling party. Now, where does it go from here? Well, you don't do predictions, do you? I mean, it seems to me that it's by no means guaranteed that the coup is going to work. You think from the kind of tide in the liberal press that it's only a matter of time before Maduro rolls over and throws his hand in. I don't think that's necessarily the case at all. I do think the army is crucial in what happens to it. And it may stay loyal to Chavismo because of its economic interest and its political interest. It may not. It may calculate that it'd be better off jumping ship and going to the opposition. The question, however, is about what's left at the base. And it seems to me that there's a very large part of the Venezuelan working class which retains its loyalty to at least the traditions of the Chavista project and the gains that it made. Chavismo can still mobilize hundreds of thousands of people on the street. You don't read about it in the press. But it's certainly true that there's a very strong support for the government as well as a very strong opposition, which is why the situation is so critical. There's also a very strong left critique inside Chavismo. They call themselves Chavismo critical Chavism, which seeks to build on the gains of the Chavez period and turn them into organs of popular power, etc. So that some of the theoretical stuff they've got is very impressive as a critique of what's happened. Whether they can lead a mass movement that's strong enough to take on the state and take on the right is another matter. Of late, this isn't the direction in which Chavez have gone, but it's absolutely crucial that if the situation is to be resolved for the benefit of working people in Venezuela, that's what socialists have to look to. It's not just about whether the right is defeated, it's about how the right is defeated. And the only way to do that, I would argue, is to go back to the levels of mobilization that we saw when the anti-Chavez coup was defeated, when the Bosses strike was defeated, and so on, when there were hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Venezuelans actively involved in securing their own political future and their own political destiny. To do that, for that mass mobilization to be possible, we also have to have in Venezuela an honest accounting of what's gone wrong with the project and what's gone wrong in the Chavista state, and a wholesale clear out of what Venezuelans call the Boliburguesia, the Bolivarian bourgeoisie, the new state elite that's taken place. If forces can emerge that actually takes on that project, then we're looking at a completely different set of struggles. If it remains mired in a confrontation between the right and a corrupt Bolivarian state, then I think we are in the realm of, which tips what in international politics and so on. So as always, we are completely against the right. We are completely against foreign intervention, but we are also for a complete upheaval in the the self-activity of the Venezuelan working class, and it's them that comes to the fore to defeat the right, to stand up for the sovereignty of Venezuela, and in the end to fight for their class interests in the same way as we see in the right fight for theirs now.